是因为时差的原因，刚刚起床不久，所以没有听到今天的这么多非常有意思的讲座。嗯、大家能够听到，能够听得到、看得到我的 PPT 吧？
可以，
好的，
可以，没有
那个
问题。
刚才张老师在讲座的时候，多次提到我，非常的感谢。我先简单的介绍一下，我刚才像赵老师说的那样，我不是做二语习得的，这不是我的本行，我是做双语和多语研究为本行的。那么双语和多语使用这个研究呢，和二语习得之间到底是什么关系？这本身呢也是一个很有意思的课题了。我今天会稍微的提到一点，但是我今天主要讲的还是translanguaging 这个超语实践。I'm going to speak in English. I'll probably switch back and forward. If there is any need for you to ask me to speak in Chinese, that's absolutely fine. So I will do that, and I can certainly answer questions in Chinese if you like. So my topic is what can translanguaging contribute to second language teaching and learning. In the last decades or so, maybe around 20 years, the relatively new concept of translanguaging has really attracted lots of attention. So if you just type in this word in Google, which we outside China depend on a daily basis, you can see nearly 400,000 in Google items. You can find the postings with the word translanguage in there. And another really important source, which is Google Scholar, that all academics depend on. If you again type in translanguaging, you will see over 16,000. These are publications, these are research publications, either books or journal articles that have the word translanguaging either in the title or in the abstract. And that is quite an amazing achievement. And actually it's taken over lots of terminologies, including superdiversity, which is a sociological concept rather than linguistic concept. None of the linguistic concepts that have been proposed in recent years is as popular as translanguaging. And translanguaging as a concept has been used in many different ways. Of course, there's linguistic landscape work that is known to lots of you already. The visual arts, people are really interested in translanguaging and the visual arts. In music, lots of people have been talking about translanguaging, and of course the translanguaging scholars also borrow lots of theories and ideas and metaphors from visual arts and from music as well. Translanguaging and gender and transgender discourses there is something that people are interested in. But fundamentally, translanguaging came out of education and is still very influential in education. It has to be said that in the education context, translanguaging is usually regarded as political, ideological act rather than simply pedagogy. So it's really important to bear that in mind, and I'm going to explain that and connecting that to language education. So translanguaging is being used as a pedagogical philosophy and approach. It's not just a method of teaching and learning. It isn't. It's very much a philosophy and a general principle and approach to pedagogy. It's also being used as a theory of language and human communication, which is really my interest in developing it theoretically and conceptually, specifically as a pragmatic theory of inference. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute. And you will see a third use of the concept of translanguaging, which is as an analytical perspective on translingual and transmodal practices. And that's something that is happening all over the world, including China. There's some really interesting studies of translanguaging, of translingual and transmodal practices. So this talk, I'm going to give you a brief history of how and where the concept started. It's important to understand that, and many of you do know that, but I want to clarify a few things. I particularly want to clarify the differences between translanguaging and other similar or seemingly similar concepts and approaches. Of course, today's forum is about second language education, second language acquisition. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the applications of translanguaging in second language teaching and learning research. It's very interesting to hear Professor Zhao's presentation about Chinese, teaching Chinese as a second language or as an international language in that particular field, rather than teaching English as a foreign language. In teaching Chinese as a second and foreign language, there's a lot of translanguaging practice and research emerging in the field now. It's important to understand the term translanguaging, moving from language to transing. It's really important to understand the prefix and the suffix. Trans means transcending, not just going in between. It really transcends the boundaries between named languages and boundaries between language and other semiotic systems that I'm going to come back to it. And the ing represents what is happening right now as we are using it. And that's why it is slightly difficult to translate this into Chinese. And sometimes I use 超语实践 to represent as it is happening now, but that particular aspect is a little difficult. So how and where did it start? And I highlighted where because the context is really important. It started in the Welsh revitalization program. Welsh is a minority, indigenous minority language. It's the dominant language of Wales, which is part of the United Kingdom. United Kingdom consists of England, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales. Wales is a semi-independent nation within the United Kingdom. It has its own government and policies. And Welsh, of course, is the national language there. But it has been minoritized because there's no monolingual Welsh speaker. All the Welsh speakers are bilingual and many are dominant in English. So for many decades now, there's been an attempt to revitalize Welsh as the language of the nation. It is not about language teaching. These revitalization programs is not about teaching Welsh because people acquire it more or less at home and in the community. It is about using Welsh to learn other subjects or contents in school. And the school policy is to encourage the use of Welsh as revitalization programs usually do. So what is the classroom reality? That's the school policy. We encourage Welsh in order to revitalize it as the dominant language of the nation. The reality is that the teacher teaches in Welsh, but pupils respond in English. As I said, there's no monolingual Welsh speaker, and most of the children are brought up with English as their predominant language for communication. Sometimes they have to read material in English because not all the teaching material is available in Welsh. But then the teacher would ask them to discuss in Welsh because that's the whole point of revitalizing the program. So one of the very experienced teacher and teacher trainer called Ken Williams in 1994 wrote a thesis, PhD thesis in the University of Bangor in Welsh. The whole thesis was written in Welsh, created this term, used this term that I can't pronounce, but in Welsh to describe the classroom reality. And the reality really is cross-language, both switching back and forth between English and Welsh, and cross-modality, so listening, speaking, reading, and writing, can be done in two languages or both languages simultaneously. Now, rather than seeing it as a problem or barrier to learning against the school policy, it is clearly, again, this classroom practice is against the school policy. But rather than seeing it as a problem and a barrier, Williams saw it as a positive way of maximizing the pupils' bilingual potential in learning. He first of all said, we have to accept that these children are bilingual. They're not monolingual. You cannot ask them to use Welsh only. They're going to fight against it, and they're going to resist it, and they're not going to do it. So rather than forbidding them to use one of their languages, in fact, their dominant language is English in most cases, we should maximize their bilingual potential in learning. Again, this is a content learning context. Revitalization is not about learning the language, it's about learning content through the language. His PhD supervisor, Colin Baker, was a professor of education in Bangor, introduced the concept to the English-speaking world by adding trans to languaging. Languaging as a concept existed for centuries in the literature. I'm going to come back to it. First of all, Colin Baker introduced it in his textbook, in the second edition of his textbook, Foundations of Bilingual Education and Bilingualism. And of course, it's now, in fact, there is going to be a seventh edition in March next year, and it's now written by Wayne Wright in the United States. And it is through this textbook that translanguaging got exposed to the English-speaking world and really become very, very well-known and well-used. From the first moment that Williams and Baker talked about this concept of translanguaging, it is conceived not as an object or linguistic structural phenomena to describe. So you can't just say, oh, is this translanguaging or is this not translanguaging? That doesn't mean anything to these people. It is a dynamic process of flexibly using all their languages and semiotic resources in the process of knowledge construction. So practice and process, these are important concepts. It's not an object or a structure to describe. It's very different from other approaches. So to them, learning is about constructing knowledge systems. And the language in which the knowledge system is constructed really, really matters. So you learn something as a knowledge system in Chinese, and you understand it in that particular way. Now, if you learn something in another language, you then construct a knowledge system in another way. And that's why we have the enterprise of translation. And that's why we sometimes find to argue, to make an argument, to express a concept in a second or foreign language is rather difficult. You have to structure the whole idea rather differently, or at least you have to structure your article or your writing rather differently, because there are different ways of constructing that knowledge. Yeah, and the language in which the knowledge system is constructed really, really matters. So they're raising through the concept of translanguaging a very, very important and political point. Is educational schooling about social control? Well, clearly it is. You know, there's no question that education is about social control. Yeah, it is about training people, turning people into a specific kind of individuals or groups in society. But is it simply about getting everybody to think the same way, or is it, or should it be allowing, facilitating, even encouraging the learner to think in their own way, independently, creatively, and critically? I guess that's a big, big question in education. These people are coming from the education context, and it's really, really important to understand their interest and background. So the concept, once introduced into the English-speaking world, was taken up by an American scholar and my dear friend and collaborator, Garcia, who wrote a book called Bilinguaging in the 21st Century, A Global Perspective. Her interest is the education, again, not just language, the education minoritized and racialized bilingual pupils in the United States especially, but across the world as well. So she gave it a much more clearer and stronger and also widely accepted definition of translanguaging, which is a dynamic process whereby language users, all of us, in this field, we tend not to differentiate between learner and user, because learning a language has to be done through use, and users are also learning language and expanding their repertoire in their lifetime. So language learning is a lifetime experience, and language use is the same. So we don't really distinguish that. But translanguaging is a dynamic process whereby language users draw on different linguistic, cognitive, semiotic, and modal resources to make meaning and make sense. I'll come back to these concepts in a minute. These are two different aspects of it. Transcending, again, the trans means transcending, not just going in between, but transcending, go beyond the boundaries between named languages and the boundaries between language and other meaning and sense-making resources, like gesture, like intonation, like color, like smell, also the spatial repertoire, everything. Especially in the digital space, we communicate in many different ways through different channels. So I'm going to focus a little bit on the pedagogical aspects of it. As I said at the beginning, there are three different uses of the concept of translanguaging. One is pedagogical philosophy and approach. One is as a theory of language and communication, and one is an application to an analytical application to translingual and transmodal practices. So beginning with the pedagogical approach and philosophy, translanguaging is set out to fight against the monolingual approach to teaching and learning, as Williams and Baker very clearly argued. The idea is monolingual language education or medium of instruction policies are wrong. They minimize the learner's potential. We want to maximize the learner's potential. Use positively, make positive use of what they know of their own languages already. So in the second language acquisition field, as you have been talking about all day today, a key concept is transfer. So have you ever considered why transfer always has to be negative? So, from L1 to L2 is usually regarded as a negative thing. Errors are caused by transfer. Can there be positive transfers? Of course there can be. And some people do study it. But on the whole, people think your mother tongue somehow interferes with your second language acquisition. In order to achieve higher level of second language learning, you have to forget about your first language. You have to go over the barriers created by your first language. And that is something that translanguaging people really want to fight against this monolingual medium of instruction, monolingual language education policies, the general monolingual approach to language teaching and learning. All languages matter. All knowledge systems matter. So the knowledge system that you all have already built up, acquired through your first language and other languages prior to learning the new language really, really matters. So it aims to transform power relations between the teacher and the pupil. So when we talk about this kind of work in Africa and in Asia, lots of native speaker native speaking English teachers say, well, I go into a classroom, there may be pupils speaking 30, 40 different languages, especially in Africa and Pacific Islands. That's very common, or even in parts of China. So I can only speak English and French. I don't know any of the local languages, so I cannot possibly use translanguaging as a pedagogy. Well, it is about transforming that power relationship between the teacher and the pupils. Let the pupils have a say. In fact, let the pupils control the teaching and learning, control the classroom. It's about enabling, it's about empowering, it's about promoting co-learning. So how much can teachers learn in the classroom from the learners? The whole concept of teaching and learning needs to be reconceptualized. And as Edward Brandmeier talked about, the pedagogy of vulnerability, the teachers need to be made to feel vulnerable, and that's actually a good thing. If they think they don't know everything, they must learn from the pupils. Then you begin to have equitable education. Translanguaging also promotes multimodalities, even transmodalities, and the use of multiple semiotic, modal, sensory, and spatial resources. And that's an important aspect of classroom-based teaching. How do we use different signs? How do we use different spaces? How do we go beyond these modal boundaries? And these are really, really important issues for the practice teacher in the classroom context. Moving on to from that, for some years I've been, as I say, I'm really a linguist, working in the field of bilingualism, multilingualism, and I follow the standard linguistic theories because that's my training. So in the linguistics standard series of linguistics and language acquisition, especially, I'm sure people know of the popular metaphor that Steven Pinker introduced into the field, which is the language instinct. So human beings have an innate desire and ability to acquire as many different languages as we like. It's only the social condition that forbids us from or creates barriers for us to acquire them and use them. Now, as soon as he introduced that metaphor, I said, well, the concept has been there since the 50s and 60s through Chomsky's generative linguistics, of course. People then propose the idea of the interactional instinct. That is, in order to trigger that innate capacity to learn different languages, we have a natural desire and innate ability to interact, not just with other people, but also with the environment and with objects around us. That interactional instinct is fundamental to human language and communication. Building on that, myself, especially, but also with Vivian Cook, my dear friend, in talking about multi-competence, introduced the idea of translanguaging instinct. That is, we have a innate drive to go beyond narrowly defined linguistic cues and transcend the culturally defined language boundaries. I'm going to explain that in a minute. This is very different from the minimalist approach in the linguistic language instinct area, where the principle of economy is really important for building linguistic theories, because ultimately we want to build robots, artificial intelligence systems to mimic human language capacity to generate language in a naturalistic kind of way. So we need that minimalist program, whereas we're operating a maximalist approach in human communication in real life a social context, and we go for the principle of abundance. What the principle of abundance says, and in fact what the translanguaging instinct says, is multiple cues are present simultaneously in producing a message. Human beings have a natural instinct to draw on as many different sensory, modal, cognitive, and semiotic resources available to them to interpret the meaning intentions while assessing the relative relevance and significance of different cues. So, for example, if you're talking to somebody face to face, as opposed to digitally, you will notice the person's facial expression, body posture, hand gesture, and of course, with intonation and everything. Yeah? So all these things come together at the same time. And in the digital environment, color, size of the font, and where it is placed, spatial configuration, all matters so much, and they all come together in that message. We have a natural instinct to draw on as many of these different cues as possible and assessing which one is a little bit more important. When somebody says, yeah, in that way, and with a tilt of their head, we know that means not quite a straightforward yes. We have that natural instinct to interpret in that way. And these different cues complement and compensate each other, and human beings read them in a coordinated manner rather than singularly. We don't read these cues singularly. We read them together. And we don't ask people to repeat. If we don't quite understand what they mean, we actually don't ask them to repeat the same structure, linguistically speaking, the linguistic structure, again and again, because that's rude, socially speaking, but also that doesn't help. So we want to draw the meaning from other cues, from facial expression, body posture, hand gesture, and intonation and everything. That's why translanguaging is fundamentally a pragmatic theory of inferencing. Yeah, in pragmatics, we have implicture and inferencing, and this is about the inferencing bit. And the inferencing is actually inferencing is one of the areas in pragmatics that's not very well developed. How do people interpret and understand each other? So let me just use that to clarify some of the confusions with other concepts. And the most confusion comes from between translanguaging and code switching. What's the difference? Well, I often say in a provocative way that that's the wrong question, because it's got nothing to do with each other. It came from very different places. Yeah, it came from minority language revitalization programs. These people have no interest in linguistics or language structures. They never knew or used the concept of code switching. Yeah, and again, from the very first day, it wasn't about describing the linguistic structure anyway. So I did a blog on the Oxford University Press blog site, and there's a link. You can have this PowerPoint later on, a couple of years ago. So to do a code switching research, code switching analysis starts with the question: how many languages are involved? You have to identify which languages, yeah, and what are they? Yeah, so these are the two fundamental questions you have to ask first before you do any code switching analysis. If you want to take a mixed code utterance or a discourse and do a code switching analysis, you have to ask how many languages and what are they involved. And then you ask, how are the different languages connected to each other structurally? And then you can ask, what are the functions? What are the meaning intentions? That's how you do code switching, yeah? Actually, when I do say, well, it's not a good question when you ask what's the difference between translanguaging and code switching. Or sometimes people show me a piece of data and say, is this code switching or translanguaging? And then I can't tell you, because you can call it anything you like. It's not a descriptive label. Even code switching scholars don't do that. Code switching is an analytical concept. It's a way of analyzing it. Whereas, translanguaging is also an analytical concept. It's not a descriptive concept. It doesn't make any sense whether you call it translanguaging or code switching. Call it anything you like. Now, translanguaging is different from code switching because it does not, first of all, regard language as just a code. So that code bit is already gone. Yeah, translanguaging does not believe there is a switch in the human brain or human mind either. So, of course, translanguage scholars don't use code switching because they don't even believe these two concepts that are represented in the concept of code switching. They don't believe language is a code. They don't believe there is such a thing as a switch. And there isn't. Yeah, and that's really important. Translanguaging focuses on meaning making by transcending boundaries of various kinds. So how meaning is made by going beyond the boundaries of various kinds between languages and between language and other semiotic systems. So it's about transgression. It's about deliberate breaking of boundaries, and it's about transformation. It's not just about moving back and forward. So it's a totally different approach from code switching. I cannot see the link, actually, and I don't know why it is causing confusion. You can describe the data in whatever way you like, with whatever terms, but the fundamental differences are that translanguaging is about how to make meaning by going beyond the boundaries, breaking these boundaries. Yeah, and that's important. So let me give you an example. So when you see this sign, how do you do, if you do a code switching analysis, use code switching as the concept, what can you actually do? Now, I noticed this sign. This is a real sign in Zhongli in Taiwan when I visited Zhongyuan Daxue. A few years back. And one of the mornings I went to a fruit store. They have these fresh fruit store. They sell cut fruit in the morning as for breakfast. And there are lots of them, in the tropics. So I just walked out of the campus and there's this little, fruit store with a sign on a little blackboard. And we know it means today's fruit is watermelon. Okay. First of all, there are 3 different languages represented. Today in Chinese, the possessive is represented by the Japanese fruit, and then English B verb is, and watermelon is represented by a picture. Now, nobody can have any doubt what this actually means. Today's fruit is watermelon. So that's that special prize fruit of the day. Now, I noticed it because in the grammar of code switching, in the code switching literature, it says you can switch content words or the content words like nouns and verbs. You cannot switch these so-called system words like possessive. You can't say today's the S, the apostrophe S in English suddenly switch to another language. It just does not make sense. But here it is, it is actually switched. And you don't tend to switch the be verb, which is, are, was, were, things that will be. It doesn't make grammatical sense, or at least grammatically speaking, these are rarely happening in naturalistic conversation. And of course, there's added semiotics. But if you do so code switching approach really cannot take you very far. It just there's no further interpretation of this, and apart from saying it violates the grammar of code switching. Yeah. But if you do a translanguaging analysis and ask the question, what is the meaning intention here? What is intended here? And what story is behind this really interesting but simple combination? I'm not quite sure what happened there. Yeah. Well, we know Taiwan was occupied by Japan, even in recent, fairly recent history. So Japanese is still highly present in Taiwan. So the simple character of Japanese possessive indicates that history, that social history there, and of course, Xigua is represented by a picture. But if you know Japanese, the pronunciation of the noun for fruit, 水果, is actually very, very similar to the pronunciation of Xigua, especially if you pronounce it in the Hokkien Taiwanese kind of way. So there's lots of really subtle indications of the history, of the social history and culture of Taiwan. And of course, if you look at the color scheme, and you know the switched bits are linked by the same color, and the nouns are in another color. And this is really, really, there are lots of things you can read from a translanguaging perspective. Now, after I left a few weeks later, a student of mine, knowing that I'm interested in this kind of thing, sent me this picture and said, "Oh, you'll be interested. It's obviously by the same shop, but it's written on paper and or made on paper. I'm stuck in the window of the same shop. Today's fruit is what?" Pineapples, yeah, 凤梨, but it's cut 凤梨切好了的, yeah, 小块的, not whole thing, yeah, and again it's for breakfast. But the cut means two different things. So one is cut, sliced, cut pineapples. One is cut price. It's a special cut price. The price is cut, and it's the color scheme again matches. Yeah, the red bit matches. So a translanguaging reading would give you a lot more interesting readings. And again, look at some of the websites like Kongish Daily. If you look at some of the text there on top of the picture, a code switching analysis cannot take you very far at all. You actually can't, it doesn't help you to understand what is meant there. And it's a high mixture. It really goes beyond the boundaries of different languages, but also mixing emoji and other things. And when you read this, you first of all look at the picture of it, the image, rather than the text. And then the color scheme really matters as well. We naturally go for a translanguaging reading of this kind of sign. And here's another. It's a poster. It doesn't actually mean the details doesn't mean much, but this is almost like an artwork, which is an artwork in fact, from Singapore. It is supposed to represent the 4 national languages of Singapore in that particular order. But actually, if you only understand one of the languages, it doesn't make any sense. And some of these so-called questions or headings don't make sense in any single language. It goes beyond. It's the breaking of the boundaries. It's going beyond, challenging the boundaries that really makes the meaning. The meaning comes from that. Yeah. And of course, in the digital environment, this is why it's often used as a translingual, as an analytical approach for translingual and transmodal practices. And you will know much better than I do. And there are some new ones, really interesting ones. And of course, these characters on the right are combining Chinese characters or radicals with English letters. There's the B and there's stylized A as well. So that's a gender neutral third person pronoun ta in that funny sense, humorous sense. So Chinese can have a gender neutral pronoun rather than representing male or female. And there are also these really interesting signs that particular soft drink shop is one of my favorite places, but it took me a little while to understand that the English name is time to play. The play is represented by that sign, start playing sign, and of course these are new creations of characters for Happy New Year and lots of other things that you're very familiar with. And for these, the only way to analyze, if you think they are meaningful and interesting, and you want to analyze it, code switching does not help you at all. Code switching as a concept does not help you. I'm not trying to kill the concept of code switching, by the way. I still use it for other things, but I'm merely saying that it doesn't help you in this context as an analytical perspective on translingual, transmodal practices. The meaning is in the making. Is it the ing bit is in transing language, is transcending the language and in doing it as we do online, especially. This is linked to the field of dynamic semantics, where people argue that the meaning is never stable and certainly does not come from the lexical meaning that somehow can be defined in the dictionary of any words. The meaning is in the making, in interaction. So the meaning making is interactive and dynamic. But for us, Translanguaging wants to argue that meaning making is also, it's of course interactive and dynamic, is in the making, but meaning making is also multimodal. It's in fact transmodal, and that's really one of the important aspects of our argument. And translanguaging is listener or reader or recipient or interlocutor oriented approach. It's about inferencing. Again, inferencing is pragmatics. Bear in mind, my first serious article on translanguaging was published in 2011 in the journal Pragmatics, and that's for a reason. I chose the journal, and the journal wanted it because it is a pragmatic theory of inferencing, and it's not just simply it's not just about how to make meaning, but how to interpret meaning, how to understand. So it's very much a recipient-oriented approach to inferencing. And methodologically, of course, if it's dealing interactional data, I'm going to talk about methods about translanguaging research tomorrow a bit more, in a different context. If it's dealing with interactional data, we tend to use multimodal conversation analysis, MCA, not just CA, but MCA. So we need the multimodal data. If it's other data like the digital creations, then it's usually the semiotic approach or multimodality analysis. So multimodality is really, really important, but it is essentially a social semiotic approach. Bear in mind, I'm working in the same department as Gunter Kress, the late Gunter Kress, Jack Bessemer and Carrie Jewett were all in the same place. So we're influencing each other in our work, of course. So coming back to second or foreign language education, translanguage, which is really the theme of today's event, of course. Translanguaging transforms the way we see language, as we already said so far. It also transforms the way we see language learning and language education. So language learning is to socialize oneself into a different way of using certain linguistic structures. So if you believe, as I do, in the more generative linguistics way, that we have the innate ability to generate linguistic structures, and all human languages share fundamental principles of linguistic features, then it is learning a different language is about learning a different way of using the linguistic structures. All linguistic structures actually exist and shared across different named languages. It not only applies to different communities, societies, nations, and cultures, but also applies to different ages, generations, genders, social groups, professions, and workplaces. So if we get a job in a different company or different institution, we have to learn the new way of using the same linguistic structures, which is a way of using it. And talking to different age groups and different genders, we have to bear in mind the different ways of using the language. So language learning is about socializing ourselves into different ways of using the language. And in that sense, it's a lifelong experience. You can't say, I don't need to learn the language anymore. You don't need to learn the linguistic structure anymore, but you need to learn how to use the language always. And that's why we don't make the distinction between learning and using. Can we use translanguaging in foreign language teaching and learning? Now, what is the purpose of learning an additional language? Well, the purpose is very simple: to become bilingual and multilingual. That's the connection between my research interest, bilingualism, and multilingualism, and your research interest in second language acquisition. It's not to replace or forget one's first language. That's not going to happen. It's simply not possible. What do bilinguals and multilinguals typically do? Well, they translanguage. They go beyond the language boundaries. They switch back and forward. They mix their languages. So why are bilinguals and their typical behavior of translanguaging not used as a target and model? But we always use monolingual L1 speaker as the model in second language acquisition, where we know we will never be able to achieve that. We're never going to be able to become another monolingual native speaker of the language. We're going to be bilingual, and we need to learn what the bilinguals actually do, use that as a model. It's also about knowledge construction. The knowledge one has acquired through one's first language, or even languages, do matter. It plays a positive role. It must play a positive role. Transfer can be positive. All languages matter. Your mother tongue matters. And beware of register loss and loss of knowledge system. So this promotion of EMI, it's a colonial legacy. And it's really surprising to understand why it becomes popular in China. Try to teach in the foreign language, in the target language only. It will lead to register loss in the sense that some students will not be able to talk about the knowledge in Chinese anymore. And, there are serious consequences of that. And I think, social-politically speaking, that's quite a big question to bear in mind. We want to move away from too much focus on language alone. In Clio, for example, which is a somewhat better approach to EMI, content language integrated learning. We want to move away from too much explicit instruction, explicit memory exercise. Move away also from the teacher-dominated learning to promote co-learning. Teacher can learn as much from their students as their students from them. Again, this pedagogy of vulnerability that is being promoted in the United States especially. And I think that needs to come to China, and Chinese language teachers need to reflect on how much we can learn from our teachers. I'll just give you a couple of examples of our recent work through my PhD students predominantly, looking at translanguaging in teaching and learning, and really about more than using the first language. Sometimes it's, I'm using a translanguaging approach in my English language class because I allow them to do translation. I allow them to use a bit of Chinese. It's not as simple as that. So Jennifer Ho, based in Hong Kong now, City University of Hong Kong, did her PhD with me, and we published a couple of articles. It's about self-directed online learning of Chinese. This is actually learning Chinese as a foreign language, as Professor Zhao talked about. And she showed how learners orchestrate diverse resources. Bear in mind, this is online. You really have to pull all sorts of resources together simultaneously. This is translanguage instinct is crucial here to transform understanding. This is about how they teach themselves how to draw relevant resources and information, how to make sense. This is the making sense bit, not just making meaning, but making sense of the meaning intentions of the platform, online platform to teach themselves Chinese, especially. So how individual adult learners of Chinese engage in self-directed learning via this platform called Memrise. I don't know whether it's available in China or not, but actually it's really, really good to use. It's Memrise, of course, it's a pun, but to use memes to help yourself to understand the language, to learn the language. You can learn all sorts of languages, and here we're only looking at how they use this platform to learn Chinese characters. So it's about informal learning, it's about mobile learning. It's also about digital technology, and how individual can be a teacher in one setting and can be a learner in another, or engage in this active knowledge exchange for themselves in this context. So we tracked 20 learners online, volunteers online over time. It is about learner autonomy. It is about agency. These classic concepts in second language learning and teaching, but from a translanguaging perspective, how translanguaging, drawing resources from modal resources, semantic resources, and digital resources, and spatial resources altogether, transforms their or enhances their autonomy and agency. So we do this kind of multimodal analysis, looking at how this particular learner, for example, we use him a lot. You know, what they're talking to themselves all the time, and how they use what do they see on the screen, and their facial expression, and what they're typing, and our analysis. We didn't do eye tracking. So this is meaning making really involves careful orchestration of multiple semiotic and modal resources. I'm running out of time, in fact. So moving on quickly, last bit. Right now, I'm doing some work with my PhD students, still ongoing PhD student Kevin Tai, also from Hong Kong. Looking at translanguaging as a pedagogical principle in EMI and CLIO classes in secondary schools in Hong Kong, where there is a colonial tradition of using English as a medium of instruction. But we're looking at how teachers bring outside knowledge and connecting students out of school knowledge into the classroom through translanguaging. Translanguaging enables them to do that in English medium instruction, mathematics class, secondary schools. How they construct different kinds of talk, including playful talk, which are equally important as the content-based talk, again, in English medium instruction, mathematics classes. And also, looking at how they co-learn. So how much the teachers can learn from the pupils, as I emphasized, through translanguaging, again, in the EMI maths class in secondary schools in Hong Kong. So this is using translanguaging as an analytical approach, the translanguaging perspective, looking at the use of different modal resources, including spatial repertoire, different kinds of knowledge, and different kinds of micro-contexts through translanguaging. Yeah, we're not interested in, do they actually switch between languages? That's not the point. It's breaking these boundaries, how they do other things through translanguaging. again, to remind ourselves, it's about the dynamic process whereby the language user and the learner draw on different linguistic, cognitive, semiotic, and modal resources to make meaning and make sense. Transcending the boundaries is really, really important. Transcending the boundaries between named languages and between language and other meaning and sense-making resources. Translanguaging as an approach and as a philosophy in second language acquisition or second language teaching and learning challenges the target language only pedagogical philosophy. It's a very different philosophy. It tries to maximize the learner's prior knowledge, including knowledge of other languages, their own languages. They want to make full use of all linguistic, cognitive, and semiotic resources, and encourage positive transfer in multiple directions. Yeah, it can be multiple direction transfer and can be positive. It's a plural linguistic approach to learning and gives agency and autonomy to the learner, and it's really important aspects of it. Of course, we want to use it for research as well, and many of you want to hear this because you want to do research on this. So don't use it as a descriptive label like code switching. It's not a descriptive label; it's an analytical concept. It's a philosophical concept. Look at how learners and teachers achieve learning through translanguaging practices, including maximum use of diverse resources. And you need to address other theoretical issues like autonomy, learner autonomy, or agency, or co-learning, or other concepts, or playful talk, as we have done, through a translanguaging sense. Not just say, oh, this is an example of translanguaging. That does not lead you very far at all. How to achieve learning through translanguaging, and how to address other theoretical issues and concepts through a translanguaging sense. That's all I have to say today. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you, Professor 李，谢谢李威老师。我们时间不是太多，还有3分钟的时间有没有老师或者同学想提问？现在那个对话框里面有一个问题，李老师可以看到吗？